if it seems to you that I talk too much about systems over goals, I think you can see in these examples the power of it. When we had good systems in the energy department, we've had more gains for getting closer to nuclear power breakthroughs than under any administration. It's because the system was good. Likewise, Azar over there in Health and Human Services, he's killing it because he's saying, how do I fix the system? How do I make it more competitive? How do I make prices more transparent? How do I make it more of a market sort of thing? Perfect. And then you look at these private solutions for the homeless. Again, not the addicted, not the mentally ill. They have different separate problems which cause them to be homeless, and they have to be dealt with separately. So when you see the power of systems for fixing things, you can't unsee it. If I were going to give out awards at the end of the year for the best cabinet department, I'd have to go with two. I'd go with Department of Energy, who, as far as I can tell, all right, I'm no expert, but just from the outside looking in, it looks like Perry just totally killed it. Like one of the most successful cabinet appointments of all time, I think. Now, I'm open to a counter argument on that, but just what I'm watching from the outside, it looks like best cabinet head of all time, maybe. But there's somebody who's almost as good, and I'm terrible at memory. Is it Health and Human Services? It seems to me that Alex Azar, every time you see him in the news, it's something really good. Something really good. And so it seems to me that cabinet officials never get much acclaim. But man, every time I saw something come out of the Department of Energy or Azar's group, it was right on. It was the right thing, right time, right system, right approach. And I will say that both those departments are working on a systems mindset. The stuff you see coming out of Health and Human Services is system changes, such as we changed our system for approving generics. So we'll get to more generics quicker. That lowers the cost almost immediately. So you see Azar being a systems fixing guy, and then you look at the Department of Energy and you see all the things that they've done. A lot of them fit into that system category. So those two guys, they need to get some kind of like big award at the end of the year from the president, because they're just really making them look good, and they're just killing it. So there are, 10 or 15 things that the administration has done that almost none of you have heard about, because they're things that happen at the industry level. So in other words, they're creating test facilities in a few different ways. The government, the Department of Energy, primarily through Perry, has funded and or approved and or created facilities for rapid testing of new nuclear technology. Now, here's what's the important part. It's the system that gets you there. If you have a good system, then probably things are working the way you want them to. You don't know where it'll end up, how fast it'll end up, but if you have a good system, you're going to be moving in the right direction. I would say that the governments, especially the Department of Energy, their system seems pretty solid. And the system is this. The industry comes to the government and they say, we want to be able to test this design. Let's say Bill Gates' company that he funds, TerraPower. They want to build a Generation 4. But they can't get the place to do it. They can't get the licenses. They might need funding. They might need other kinds of resources that only the government could provide. So they come to the government, to presumably the Department of Energy, and they say, we need all this stuff. In order to make nuclear successful, we got to be able to test it. We got to build a prototype, et cetera. And the Department of Energy has been apparently really, really good. Here's my idea for a system improvement. Okay? Now, it might be we don't need this because we already have the testing facilities we need through the Department of Energy. But if we don't, I would recommend the following. Now, the improvement on what I'm going to suggest in the nuclear field and in the climate change field is the psychology of it. All right, so what I'm going to suggest is primarily fixing the psychology of the system. And the psychology is people are afraid of nuclear energy, and they don't want it in their backyard. All right, so that's the psychology. And if you don't put it in people's backyard, it's too far away, right? It wouldn't be hard to find a remote place to put a nuclear reactor, but you don't need it there because there's nothing to power. So here's my suggestion. I would love to see a nuclear test facility in a very remote place where even if the nuclear power plant works, it's not really close to anything. But here's the second part. You ready? It's a double test facility. Two things are being tested. Initially, it would be nuclear test plants. So they build small modular nuclear plants, and maybe multiple of them, all in the same general area, but away from people. And here's the second part. Once you have at least one of them working and up and creating electricity, you turn it into secondarily a carbon scrubbing test site with free electricity. So in other words, if you get one of the nuclear modular plants, let's say it's a small nuclear plant that's a test plant, once you get it working and you say, well, we built it and it's working, but there are no cities around here, there's nothing to test. So instead, we're going to make this also a test facility for those carbon scrubbing machines. There are a bunch of technologies that do it. They literally draw the carbon out of the air, and in many cases, they can turn it into a product. One of those products is jet fuel. So you can actually take the jet fuel out of the air, reconstitute it as jet fuel, because you're taking the carbon out and turning it into jet fuel. And jet fuel is the one thing that you can't do with electricity. You can't replace a jet with electricity, at least not in the near future. So imagine, if you will, that you've built a test site for cleaning CO2 out of the air. And it happens to be next to a test site for a nuclear plant that's giving it free electricity, because the biggest expense for cleaning CO2 out of the air is the energy. If you can make the energy cheap, you can suck the CO2 out of the air, no problem. So that's my suggestion. You fix the psychology of it by taking it into the remotest area and making it a CO2 scrubbing area, because air is air. It should be able to scrub the CO2 no matter where it is, I think. Does it matter where your CO2 scrubber is located? Maybe it does. Maybe you have to be closer to coal plants or something to optimize. Here's another systems approach to homelessness. Whenever I talk about homelessness, I will try to bore you by saying that drug addiction and mental health are driving much, if not most, of homelessness. And you can't solve those two things by giving somebody a home, because that wasn't the problem in the first place. It was drugs and mental health. But that said, there are still lots and lots of people who could really benefit from a super cheap place to live. And I just heard about the smartest one I've ever seen. And I'm going to say this with complete confidence. What I'm going to describe next is the smartest solution I've ever seen to homelessness. Are you ready? It did not involve the government. That's pretty smart already, right? So everything I'm going to describe, no government funding. There might have been some involvement in the government to permit it to happen, but that's not talked about in the article I read, so I don't know. And here's the system. So a group called Good Samaritans, they're some sort of religious charitable group, in Austin, Texas, they built a village for those in need with no public funding. So they started with, I think, 51 acres. So they had some cheap land wasn't being used for anything. And then they put on it tiny homes. And the tiny homes, apparently, you could build, any kind of tiny home that a volunteer wanted to build. And they would have central bathrooms. So the homes did not necessarily need a kitchen. The homes do not need a bathroom, because you just walk outside and there's a central bathroom somewhere. They also converted old campers. So if you had an old camper that was no longer roadworthy, well, it's a place for somebody to sleep inside. So you'd put that on your 51 acres. You'd make sure it was close enough to other facilities, because I guess they could walk to food and showers and whatever. Then the residents themselves get breaks on the rent for working there. So the people who live there are also the workers. So somebody would be, it's their job to clean up, clean the bathrooms, that sort of thing. And apparently they've been operating for years successfully. Did you hear that? They've been operating for years successfully. It's actually so good that these, let's call them super low income people. So the people who live there really didn't have a lot of options. I'll call them super low income. And when they talk to them, those people are like, I could just live here forever. I mean, basically, you've met all of my needs. I don't see how it can get much better. Somebody says, so it's a trailer park. They actually describe it as sort of a souped up trailer park. In other words, some of them are trailers, some of them are different structures that are small houses, tiny homes, probably just enough to sleep in. But yeah, but if you imagine a mobile home, but built in sort of a campsite way, where I think they have a central, I believe they're built in a ring around a central area where there are central services. So, I forgot the most important part. I described this whole thing and I left out actually the important part. All right. So everything you've heard so far is just context. Here's the important part. They built it with a design from person first. Sounds like nothing, right? They designed this place from the person out. That's a different system than what you see. What is the normal way to build a home? The normal way is construction first. You say to yourself, well, if I need to build an inexpensive home, what's the cheapest way to do that? And then you end up with an apartment building. Then you put all the people in the apartment building, it costs too much, they can't take care of it. And here's the part that's important. You stick people in an apartment, they don't meet their neighbors for the most part. They become like a little isolated unit that just happens to be in a building that has lots of other isolated units. By building the homeless thing the way they did, they started with human beings as social creatures. So they said, we're building a place for a human being. We're not doing a construction project. We're solving a problem for humans. What do humans need first? Well, shelter. So anything that gives them a roof and some warmth will satisfy that. So that's not a big design thing. So the next thing is, if they have shelter, what's the next thing they need? Besides food and healthcare. And the answer is social, community, right? So the design breakthrough, if you will, the thing that makes this different from everything else, is that they started with the person, and they say, what's a person need? What's a human need? And it's community. And the idea is that with these small communities in which you're forced to interact, because all the services are central, if you want food or whatever, and you're working at the facility, so if you have a job, you're probably in the facility, you're interacting with all the other people, they're in similar circumstances, you would not feel any restriction to talk to anybody else who's there, because you're all there under sort of the same circumstances. So apparently the community variable is what makes this magic. So it starts with no government interference. So I'm going to describe it as a system now. So the first thing that's good is it starts with no government, because that gets you out of all the government problems. All the politics go away. So that's good. Now, you also have to get the cost way down, because if the government's not involved, who's paying for this stuff? All right, it's got to be inexpensive. So that's where the land that wasn't being used for anything might have even been donated. I don't know. So you get your free land. You go to some place where the weather is not going to kill people. Now, in this case, it's Austin, and I don't know what they knew about air conditioning. I didn't read that. But clearly, there are places in the world in which the weather is more conducive, Southern California, for example. So you've got no government. You're going super cheap with free land. We could definitely get free land all over the country. There are tons of free land. In fact, the whole blight projects that Bill Pulte works on, those are big swaths of cleared land. Now, if they're in winter zones, they might not be so useful. But maybe St. Louis. Take St. Louis for an example. Would St. Louis be temperate enough that if you had a bunch of free land and you could put tiny homes on them and organize communities, would that work in St. Louis? I don't know. So then the other part of the system is that they design it around community and give them jobs and stuff. So everything about this I love. Instead of focusing on the construction, they focused on the human beings, and they got a good result, and it's reproducible. They've been doing it for years, and the people like it. Totally works. Let's talk about the system for the rest of them, the addicted and the mentally ill. The system has one gigantic broken part that you're seeing a lot of action toward fixing. So California has some advocates. You'll see Dr. Drew, you'll hear Michael Schellenberger talking about this specifically. And here's where the system is broken. You can't force anybody to do anything. So even if somebody is dangerous to themselves, then, there's probably some limit to danger to yourself. But if you're just addicted or you have a serious mental illness and you don't want help, our current system doesn't allow it to happen. And so those people just are left to their own resources. So the part of the system that needs to be fixed is just that one choke point. There needs to be a series of objective, I guess it has to be a little bit subjective, but as close as you can get to an objective set of variables that police or health services can say, all right, for this person, I know they don't want to go, but this time we just have to make it happen. Because sometimes you just got to take care of people. Now, some of you may say, no, we don't need to do that. We can just force them off the streets, and if they die, they die. It's not my problem. Now, probably a lot of people have that opinion. But if you want to help, there's no getting around the fact that it has to be involuntary. Nobody has come up with the second way to do this. If there were two ways to do it, I'd be telling you. I'd be saying, well, we got this way, and we got this way. Maybe let's do a test, see which one of those two ways work. But we don't. We have the way we're doing, which absolutely doesn't work, and everybody would agree. And then we have one proposition for fixing it, just one. There's exactly one idea on the table for fixing anything. And it starts with involuntary help, basically, for some people under some circumstances. So when you see the power of systems for fixing things, you can't unsee it.